Hello, everyone. I am Christine Gritman, and this, of course, is Let's Talk About Brand. I'm here doing the show every single Friday at 12 noon Eastern, or whatever time it is where you are, and I would love to know where you are. Speaking of where you are, not just where you are geographically in the world, I would also love to know if you're joining us live or on the replay, and if you're joining us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube, since we're live on all of them right now. We don't just do Let's Talk About Brand every single week, Fridays at noon. I also have a Twitter chat called Chat About Brand, which is on Tuesdays at noon Eastern Time, and it is always on the same topic as we're asking our Friday guest about. In fact, the last question of the chat is always about if people have any questions for my Friday guest, and thankfully we did have a few this week. Speaking of questions for our guest, if you're joining us live, please do bring those questions into the comments. I would love to ask them. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to get going with the show. This week's guest, Anna Brand. Best name, right? And that is, in fact, her real name. And how convenient, she's not just any old designer, she is a brand designer. She helps brands establish their visual identity, which includes all sorts of things. You know, the obvious like logos and color palettes, but everything beyond that. We're going to talk about all those elements that go into a visual brand identity. So without any further ado, let's bring on Anna Brand. Hey, Anna, how are you?
Hi, hello. How are you doing?
You probably hear all the time about how perfect your name is.
Yes.
You do.
I always say it took me years and years to find the right man.
Mm-hmm.
I'm married. Yeah, I'm married into it, which is still quite bizarre. But yeah,
It works. It works. It's a match made in heaven.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we are, of course, talking about visual brand identity. So first, I'd actually love to hear sort of your definition of that and what constitutes a visual brand identity, because it's so much more than just a logo or like the color red.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you see, I see it as it's a form of communication. It's if you see it as a tool to actually communicate and connect with and attract, that is the purpose of it. It's not a case of, right, I'm going to get a logo done and that's my identity, that's my logo. It's way more than that. It's a visual language. So it's really super important because everything about that is communicating something to your audience. And if you're not communicating the right kind of message to the right people, then you're not going to be attracting the right kind of people. You're going to attract the wrong people or put people off altogether, depending.
So to that end, the right type of people, the wrong type of people, the right type of impression, the wrong type of impression. How do you work with people to figure that out? What are some of the questions you ask them? Because I imagine sometimes you get clients who haven't done that pre-work on their own necessarily. So let's talk about how you sort of get that out of them so that you can do better work.
Yeah. Well, I get a lot of people come to me who say things like, I've worked with a designer before and I had a really bad experience, or I didn't like what they came up with. And I'll say, well, what was the process? And they'll say, well, I told them I wanted this. They asked me a couple of questions and then they presented me with this. And it's completely, it's not what I was expecting. It's all wrong. I didn't like it. And I thought, and when I speak to them, it's a lot of the time, it's just because they haven't gone through any kind of process to figure out, well, first of all, you've got to know who your audience is. You've got to know who they are, what you've got to know your own brand, what it's about, what kind of message you want to communicate. And but mainly it's all about that audience. It's who they are and making sure that everything around your visual is speaking to those people so that you're attracting the right kind of people. So it's really understanding, that's the starting point, understanding who they are.
And how do you suss out what is going to speak to those people? Because it's one thing to just say, okay, we're speaking to, middle-aged mothers of two, but how do you know what I want to see? What does that look like? How do you sort of translate that audience into a visual?
Well, that's the difficult part. But so if, for example, you know the age group, you know what kind of things they are into, you know, especially if it's, let's say you're a clothing brand, you're going to know that audience, you need to know them really, really well, and you need to know, so obviously, what their likes and dislikes are. So you're going to know whether you're going to pick your color palette, for example, based on who the audience is. Who is it? Is it supposed to be loud and angry? Is it supposed to be pink and fluffy? Is it supposed to be? But that's all, you know, really, really basics. But it's really looking into who they are, and it's the other thing is the finding a hook. So it's not just creating a static logo. The other thing that's really important is to try and find that something that's going to hold it all together. So if, for example, you look at who that audience is and you look at what you want your brand to communicate, it's finding that visual hook, and it's having all of this information, being able to put that into the simplest form possible, and having something that you can hook all of this onto, that one idea, that one concept that you can then take forward into the whole rest of the identity. So it's not just something static, it's something that can move throughout everything and communicate throughout all of your marketing materials and anything visual that you do.
Perfect. So what are some of those specific elements that you like having defined for people? Like, what would go into your ideal, okay, I'm creating visual brand identity for you. What are all of the elements that you think are important for people to have?
So as in with the finished identity, as in what you would hand over to that client. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. What are all the elements? So like you know, maybe a logo is not essential, or maybe it is a good to have, but basically if you could kind of do the works, what are some of those elements that you would design for people as their visual brand identity?
It's not, so again, so it wouldn't be just, so yes, okay, you're going to have your visual, you're going to have that one logo, that one mark, but that mark has to be really versatile and really adaptable. It has to work across all of the different environments. So it's a case of you have that visual mark, but you also have different elements of that. You have different abstract versions. You might have a background patterns. You want to be able to give your clients something that they can give to any designer, or that they themselves can take into something like Canva and be able to create something with a lot of depth, which can feed across. So if you think about your social media feed, for example, it's all of the different elements working together. So you don't just have to see that one mark and that one logo to know that that's who that is. You just need to swipe past. So you'll know some. So for example, if you think about your feed, if I'm scrolling through Instagram and I scroll past you, I can see straight away, and I don't necessarily need to see the name or you know, your face, but I can see by the way that, you know, the typeface that you use and the color that you use. But it's bringing it's having all different elements that you can use across. So whether it's, like I say, whether it's a background pattern, whether it's so I've just worked with a company, and we've created lots of different patterns, but it's so synonymous with them that this pattern, wherever it is and however it is put across, it always looks like that exact same brand. You can just tell.
I love that. And that's so important that you have, you know, sort of a variety of things. If it were dependent on just being my face, I mean, that would be pretty boring from a content perspective. And I love what you pointed out about it being applicable across all sorts of different usages and content types. When I first launched my brand 5 years ago, I did have a logo, but I didn't use it very much because it only worked in certain contexts. It worked best square, and it worked best kind of big. If you made it too small, you could see kind of the pretty part, but you couldn't see the words beneath that gave context.
Yeah, that's it.
It wasn't effective.
So when you see people's profile pictures and you see that the logo, you know, it's cropped off somewhere or other, and they don't have a different version or a different variation that they can use in that context, which is still going to be synonymous with them. So you need to have, you're going to have a long version, you're going to have a stacked version, and you need to have all of this needs to come together so that, like you say, it can work in all of the different environments and be completely versatile.
When it comes to a brand color palette, I mean, Obviously there's brands like me where we have the dominant color, but there is a palette. I mean, it's also black and white. Those are the kind
Yeah.
of the other colors. So about how many colors do you think is good for a brand to typically have in their color palette in order to give them enough differentiation but also enough flexibility?
Yeah. Well, again, it completely depends. It completely depends on the brand and what it is they're trying to communicate, what they are all about. Because it could be that you have a very strong brand. You want to be, maybe you want to be loud, or you want to. So if you take your red, for example, it can be used in lots of different contexts. So it can mean powerful, it can mean loud, it can be, well, some lingerie would use red, if you can say it, it can mean that. Depending on how you use it, it can mean angry. But and you could just stick with what, one or two colors and really push that color forward because it's very prominent. But it's always good to have, for example, and you've got your primary colors and you've also got secondary colors, but you always want to be using those primary colors more, 90% or 80% of the time, depending on your brand, on the identity, so that they become synonymous with you. But bringing in those other colors, it might be that you use other colors to differentiate between different services, different products. But yeah, again, it completely depends on that particular brand.
Is there sort of a maximum number that you think,
Um,
after which would lose effectiveness as a palette?
yeah, I mean, if you had like 10 different colors, it would probably get a little bit, unless again you had 10 different services underneath and you only use those within, on your website for different buttons, things like that. But if you just hide, 10, 12, 15 different colors into your color palette, there's no one's going to really understand which one
Yeah.
is you.
What are some ways to pull something like that together? So let's say I'm a brand that has 10 different colors in the palette and it's about different categories. And I'm putting together a piece of social media content that's, words on that color background or something. How can I sort of tie those things together? What are some elements I could use to tie together things that are using this different sort of.
So all of the different colors.
Yeah.
I would be quite strict with how you use them. So, for example, if you had a yellow and a purple and a green in there, for example, I would only use the yellow for maybe highlighting a certain text that you always use, and I would maybe only use the other color for buttons, for example, and be quite specific so they come out in the same way each time, so it doesn't get confusing. You need to have that structure. So hence why, so if you work with a designer, really what you should get at the end of that is a style guide. So that you can look at that and you'll know exactly how to use each color. So is one of them, one of them is going to be, for example, an accent color. So you might be that you have a bit of italic in some of your posts, and that italic is just, accentuating a certain point or a certain word. Then you would use that color, but use it consistently in that way all the time, and all of your colors consistently.
I love what you said also just now about kind of if you're working with a designer, you should get that style guide so that you know how to apply these visual elements in different ways. You also mentioned the idea of being something that people can kind of play with and use going forward in something like Canva. So what are some useful things to sort of, if you're a brand who's about to start working with a designer and you do want to be able to not have to go back to the designer to design every little thing. You want to be able to design your own social media content, for example. So what are some things that you consider especially useful to have in that regard?
So definitely, well, within the style guide, it definitely pointing out and being, because things have changed. So 10 years ago, I didn't have to tell people exactly how to use it because they were always going to come to me and I would always do that. But things have changed now and people want to be able to create their own, their own graphics, and that's really cool. And I think you've got to make it as easy as possible for your client to do that. So you can pass something to them and they don't necessarily have to come back to you if it's something as simple as that. So it's just important within the style guide to show exactly where those colors are going to be used, how they're going to be used, but even things like showing them how to use the logo on top of images, on top of photographs, because people quite often get that very wrong. So then, they'll put the wrong color on top of a dark image or the wrong color on top of a light image. And it's just being very specific with how you use each element so that they can then do that moving forward themselves. Or, I mean, what I do is as well, I will set them up a load of templates in Canva. So literally all they have to do is change the color, drop a different image in, and it's really easy. But it's great that people are starting to do that themselves. But it's just making sure that when they go away, they have the tools and they have the guide to be able to do that well, rather than they go away and they trash it.
I'm sure that's very hard to see as a designer. You brought up two really good points that I want to dig into a little deeper. You mentioned putting like a logo on an image. So there's two separate parts of that I want to hear your thoughts on. One of them is obviously, you know, you're defining things like the logo, if relevant, fonts, colors, templates sometimes. But how do you also, as a designer, help your clients with figuring out what type of imagery, photography, iconography to use? And if so, what guides that?
Again, it's all down to getting the bit at the beginning right. So it's diving into who your audience is, how you want your brand, how your brand is supposed to be coming across and perceived. So it's really understanding what your brand is, what it is about, who the audience is, and how you want to communicate to that audience. It all comes down to the customer. I think just as soon as you start putting the customer at the forefront of every decision that you make, whether it is what post you're going to put out there, what colors you use, what blog post you write, I think everything changes. It's just be 100% customer centric in every decision you make.
That makes sense. So you don't have to say, oh, make sure that they're always on a red background or anything that extreme. Just making sure that you're always figuring out what your customer needs to see. That makes sense. And then the other question is, I know a lot of people out there, especially personal brands, often don't know if they really need a logo. We have right here, Tim in the comments said, I confess I've never had a logo apart from my own podcast. And, you know, it makes sense for a podcast to have a logo. Not every person needs a logo. So what are your feelings on determining whether or not a logo is or isn't part of the job?
I think even if you're not going to go down the route of having a logo, I still think it is very, very important how you put yourself across visually online. It's the same as how you dress in public. It's the same as if I turned up to a meeting wearing a pair of tracksuit bottoms, with messy hair. In my particular industry, I don't think it would go down very well. It's even if your visual brand is you in a pair of tracksuit bottoms and wearing a cap, whatever, it's still a visual language that you're using. It's still a visual way that you are communicating with your audience, and you need that to be right. You need that to be attracting the right people and sending out the right message.
That makes sense. So whether or not it's actually a little designed mark or if it's just, you know, the way things present in general.
Yeah, it might just be that it's the color palette. It might be the way that you lay this out. But if I know if I go onto a feed, there is going to be the odd person that says, "Oh, well, it doesn't bother me." But it's the majority that it does. It does. You visually, the way you visually come across will affect your business. So it might be, like I say, it might be just a color palette that you use. It might be a certain way that you stand. It might be, you know, if there's two of you, it might be that you're always, you know, one's one side, one's always. But it's important and it's consistent and it's always telling a message. Whether you think it is or it isn't, it's always telling a message.
What you just mentioned about the different sides, that makes me think of Andrew and Pete. I know they're very distinct about that. I took a selfie with them once where they were on the wrong sides and they said, "Oh God, no, don't post that."
See, so it matters. It matters to them, but it matters to other people. Some people get, you know, they see that all the time and they want Andrew and Pete. You want them to be that way. And if they do something different, it's like, why have they done that?
Yeah, they shouldn't be allowed to even stand next to each other on the wrong side. It's just confusing. So you kind of already answered. I'm moving now to our viewer questions. And Tim points out, he said that you need a style, if nothing
Yes.
else, which is so true. And, you don't necessarily need a logo as long as you have a recognizable style. And if you're a personal brand, again, you kind of are your logo. I mean, my face is my logo in a sense. I have a logo as well. It's there, but still. Okay, so this you kind of answered already, but it's a slightly different phrasing. So Micah Sakai, who participated in our chat, wanted to know, what are the must-ask questions when you work with your clients for the first time? So I know that you mentioned straight off the bat, who were they talking to? But do you have specifically like an intake script, or do you sort of ask different people different questions depending on what you can suss out for yourself?
No, I've always got it will always change depending again on the client, but I always have my set questions, and we always go through how do you want people to feel when they come into contact with your brand? And I think that's really important. And it doesn't matter what you do, whether you're a coach, whether you sell products, how do you want them to feel? And then we go through through values, brand values, because all of these are important. And once I get the answers, once I delve into pulling out the right things that I need in order to build a picture, I will then I don't touch a computer until the very end. I don't. Everything is a lot of research, a lot of brainstorming, a lot of going, right, I've got all of this information about who they are, what their values are, what they want to stand for, how they want people to feel when they come into contact with you. And then I have to go, right, how can I put this into the simplest form possible? How can I visualize this so that it will talk to these people?
Love that. And again, you're echoing what we always talk about on Let's Talk About Brand and Chat About Brand, which is that you can't start with the visuals. You have to start with what they're expressing and what they're representing. So this is a good lesson for everyone. Last call for live viewer questions. And I'm going to bring us another question from the chat, which is Teodora Emma Pirchu wanted to know, when is the right time to move from DIY to professional design? Or even vice versa. It's possible you're launching with the designer, but maybe there reaches a point where you can prolong it yourself. But what's a good time to sort of enlist a professional, essentially?
Well, I think any time that you're very serious about, moving forward and giving
It froze on my end, and I can't tell if it's actually frozen. If someone can let me know in the comments if Anna has frozen or not. Could just be me. Okay. Well, if anyone in the chat can, please let me know if she's frozen on your end as well, or if it's just me. It's as frozen as a Disney film. Okay, but I'm not frozen. Is that correct? All right. Hopefully Anna will be able to rejoin us. I'm going to certainly have my eye on her input there. Oh, and she left, unfortunately. Okay, well, hopefully she'll be able to pop back in a minute, but if not, definitely check her out. Her name is Anna Brand. That is her real name. On Twitter, she is _brand design, or no, brand creative. Sorry about that. But she's pretty easy to find. I mean, you can tell that she's her because she is, of course, well branded. She has that great sort of aqua turquoisey color that you'll see in all the promos for this show. And she's pretty easy to find. So definitely check out Anna Brand. Easy to remember. And speaking of checking things out, I would like to remind everybody that I do this show, Let's Talk About Brand, every single Friday at 12 noon. Next week's actually will not be live, but it will be broadcast as though live. I won't be pretending. I'll make sure people know that it is a broadcast of a recorded episode. But I will tell you about that in just one moment because we have Anna coming back in to finish answering the question. Yay, Anna! Glad
I don't
you
know what
made it
happened
back.
there.
I don't know. I mean, Mercury is retrograde right now, so that's what I'm blaming it on. But yes, so if you could just tell everyone about the time to enlist a professional. As you said, it's kind of like when you're ready to get serious about your brand, but beyond that.
Yeah. It can be lots of different things. One, it can be that you are maybe your products have changed, maybe your services have changed, and you're not speaking the same language that you used to. Because when you start out in business, as everybody knows, it completely changes, doesn't it? How you start off to how you become a year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. So it could be that. It could be, as again, nobody can afford at the very beginning to work with a designer, so they create something which is absolutely cool. You know, might get something free, they might do whatever, but which will last them in the short term. But now they're ready to get more serious. It could be that you're just attracting the wrong kind of people, and I don't think people realize how much it affects. So, for example, if I'm looking for a business coach and they come across and they use a lot of, let's just say they're a bit pink and they're a bit glittery and it would turn me off because that's kind of not who I am, and I don't want to work with somebody
but it
like
would turn
that.
other people on. So yeah, it's important to understand, look at who you're getting and look at what you're putting out there.
And if you think, and everybody, you know, because people buy from people, we all know that now. And if we all know that and we all agree with that, then we surely must realize that how you put yourself across visually is really, really important. Really important.
Absolutely. And Tim brings up a good point, which is that people spend too much money early on, oftentimes in business, before they really know what they want to do.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen that. I've seen people who I've spoken to who are at the early stages, they're pre-launch in their business, and they're not ready to work with me yet. Because still figuring out all these other things, and yet they have a professionally designed logo already. I'm just like, why?
Exactly. No, you need to get into that. You need to get that delve into what it is you're all about and what it is you want to communicate before you start visually communicating it. So yeah, absolutely. It's when you get to the point in your business, you know, when you just know, you know, when it clicks, and you know who you want to be finally, and you're like, that's it. That's at the point when you should enlist a designer.
Love it. All right. So we are definitely at time, but please tell everyone where they can and should find you.
So yeah, you can find me. My website is annabrandcreative.com, or you can find me on Instagram, Facebook. It's all the same. It's all the same. It's Anna Brand Creative.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here, Anna. I'm glad we were able to pull it together. I'm also glad that I got to meet you in real life.
I know.
In Newcastle upon Tyne for Indra and Pizza Tamacon in November.
Yes, it was excellent.
Yes, really, and I'll be seeing you again in June 2023, I hope, for that.
100%. 100%.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. All right. So as I was saying, we do this show every single Friday at noon. Next week's will not be live. I'm pre-recording. My guest is in Africa. Plus, I have a day job now. I actually have a meeting I have to be on next Friday. So it will be a replay, but I will be coming into the comments. So please really do let me know if you're watching it next week. And especially, you can still impact the show and the content of the show, even if it's not live, by participating in the chat on Tuesday. Again, the Twitter chat on Tuesday, Chat About Brand, is always on the same topic as the Friday guest. So next Tuesday, that Twitter chat topic is working with brands. So working with brands as an influencer, working with brands as a brand partnership, whatever you're interested in doing. And so my Friday guest, who I would love for you to ask questions of, is someone who has done a lot of this. His name is Joe Human. Again, 2 cool last name guests in a row. Joe Human He is in, I believe, South Africa, and he has worked with a ton of brands. He has built a career as an influencer. So he's going to talk about working with brands, what they need from you, what you need from them, how to assess a good partnership and make sure that everyone is bringing that value. So please do join us next week for that. Thanks very much. Bye.